She thought she was correcting a mistake, but she was actually exposing her own ignorance in front of everyone who mattered. The Grand Meridian Ballroom in Manhattan was glowing under rows of crystal chandeliers, each light reflecting off polished marble floors like quiet stars trapped indoors. Guests in formal attire filled every table, their voices blending into a soft hum of anticipation as the final preparations for the wedding ceremony reached their peak. At the center of it all stood Ava Johnson, the black wedding planner responsible for orchestrating every detail of the evening with precision that most people in the room did not even realize they depended on. She moved with calm control between floral arrangements, lighting adjustments, and final seating confirmations, her focus absolute, her expression steady. To her, this was not chaos. It was structure under pressure, and she had mastered it. Across the main aisle, Emily Hastings, the bride, stood surrounded by her bridal party. Her dress was flawless, her makeup carefully done, her image carefully curated for perfection. But beneath that perfection, frustration had been building throughout the evening. A minor delay in one of the floral installations had disrupted her expectation of absolute control, and in her mind, someone needed to be held responsible. Her gaze landed on Ava as she approached the ceremony layout once again, calmly adjusting a centerpiece by a few inches. "Excuse me," Emily called out sharply, her voice cutting through the ambient music and conversation. The surrounding guests began to quiet, sensing tension forming. Ava turned slightly, maintaining her composed posture. "Yes, Miss Hastings," she replied evenly. Emily stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor with increasing impatience. "Did I stutter?" she said, her tone rising just enough for nearby guests to hear. "Fix it. Now. I've been watching this all evening, and it is still not right." The room shifted subtly as attention began to concentrate on the exchange. Some guests exchanged glances. Others pretended not to listen while clearly doing exactly that. Ava did not react emotionally. She simply looked at the arrangement again, then back at Emily. "I understand your concern," she said calmly. "I will adjust it immediately." Her response was not defensive. It was controlled, professional, and devoid of resistance. That lack of reaction, however, did not calm Emily. If anything, it made her more irritated, as though silence itself was disrespect. Nearby staff members subtly straightened, aware of the imbalance forming in the room. A hotel coordinator glanced toward Ava with quiet concern, but Ava gave no sign of distress. She simply returned to her work, carefully correcting the arrangement with precise movements. Guests began to whisper softly, not about the mistake, but about the way Ava was being spoken to. Something about it felt uncomfortable, even to strangers who had no stake in the event. Yet Emily remained focused on her expectation of perfection, unaware that her frustration was no longer the center of attention. It was the reaction of the room that was beginning to shift. And somewhere deeper in the ballroom, unnoticed by most, a quiet awareness was forming among those who understood that how a person treats service is often more revealing than the service itself. The tension inside the Grand Meridian Ballroom continued to build in silence after Ava Johnson returned to her work without hesitation. Guests who had witnessed the exchange between her and Emily Hastings could not easily return to their previous conversations. Something about the moment had changed the atmosphere, even if no one openly acknowledged it. The chandeliers still shone with warm elegance, and the music still played softly in the background. Yet attention in the room had shifted in subtle waves toward the center of the event, where Ava continued, making final adjustments with calm precision. Emily, still standing near her bridal party, expected immediate correction and visible urgency. Instead, she watched Ava complete the adjustment without rushing, without visible stress, and without acknowledging the emotional tone that had just been directed at her. That lack of reaction created an unfamiliar discomfort. Not anger, but uncertainty. Across the ballroom, conversations began to take a different shape. At one table near the glass wall overlooking Manhattan, a hotel executive quietly leaned toward a guest. "She is the one who managed the Langford Charity Gala last year," he said, keeping his voice low. The one where everything was almost canceled the night before. The guest raised an eyebrow, and she fixed it. The executive nodded. She did not just fix it. She rebuilt the entire schedule in under 6 hours and still delivered flawlessly. At another table, a photographer added his own observation without being asked. Every major event I have covered where she was in charge ran smoother than events with entire planning teams twice her size. These comments did not spread loudly. They spread carefully, like pieces of information being quietly passed from person to person. And with each passing moment, the perception of Ava in the room began to shift. Emily, however, was not hearing these conversations. She was focused on the visual outcome of her wedding environment, still unaware that her authority was beginning to feel less absolute in the eyes of others. Meanwhile, at the far end of the ballroom, near the private entrance, a change in presence occurred that few people immediately noticed. Ethan Kong had arrived earlier than most expected, moving quietly through the periphery of the event space. His appearance was understated, yet it altered the awareness of the staff who recognized him. Conversations lowered instinctively as he passed. Security adjusted their posture. Hotel personnel gave brief, respectful nods. He did not acknowledge the attention. Instead, his gaze moved across the room with measured observation. It eventually settled on Ava Johnson. He did not interrupt. He did not approach. He simply observed her as she coordinated with a lighting technician and redirected a floral arrangement with minimal instruction. Her movements were efficient, deliberate, and calm under pressure. Ethan remained still for a moment, then shifted his focus briefly toward Emily. The contrast was immediate. One person demanded control through emotion. The other maintained control through discipline. At that moment, a small technical issue arose near the main stage where a section of decorative lighting failed to synchronize with the ceremony sequence. A stage assistant quickly signaled concern, and for a brief second, uncertainty rippled through the technical team. Before the situation could escalate, Ava was already moving. She approached the control area, spoke briefly with the technician, reviewed the settings, and adjusted the sequence timing with calm authority. Within moments, the lighting stabilized and returned to its intended rhythm. No announcement was made. No attention was drawn to the correction. The issue simply disappeared. Guests who noticed it were left with a quiet impression rather than disruption. Emily, however, interpreted the moment differently. To her, Ava's continued presence in operational decisions felt like resistance to her authority rather than competence under pressure. She began to walk back toward Ava with increasing frustration, unaware that the room around her was no longer aligned with her perception. Ethan's eyes remained on Ava, not in judgment, but in recognition. And slowly, without anyone speaking it aloud, the balance of perception inside the ballroom began to shift in a direction no one, especially Emily Hastings, was prepared to accept. The atmosphere inside the Grand Meridian Ballroom had shifted once again, becoming heavier with each passing minute. Guests who had initially treated the evening as a flawless luxury wedding were now quietly aware that something deeper was unfolding beneath the surface. The chandeliers continued to cast a soft golden glow across the polished marble floor, and the floral arrangements remained perfectly aligned, yet attention no longer belonged entirely to the ceremony design. It belonged to the interactions between people. Emily Hastings moved with increasing frustration as she approached Ava Johnson once more. Her heels echoed sharply against the marble, cutting through the softer sounds of the room. She stopped just a few feet away from Ava, who was speaking briefly with a lighting technician. "I thought I made myself clear earlier," Emily said, her voice controlled but edged with irritation. Several nearby guests turned their attention toward the exchange. Ava turned slowly, maintaining her calm expression. "Yes, I understood your request," she replied evenly. "The adjustment has already been made." Emily glanced toward the ceremony setup, then back at her. "Then why does it still not look exactly the way I want it to look?" The question lingered in the air, drawing quiet attention from those nearby. Ava did not react defensively. She simply considered the space for a moment before responding. "Some elements are already aligned with structural requirements from the venue. Adjusting them further would disrupt the timing and flow of the ceremony. Her tone was factual, not argumentative. Emily's expression tightened. "I am the bride. I decide what looks right." A brief silence followed. It was not dramatic, but it was noticeable. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Across the ballroom, Ethan Kong continued to observe without interruption. He had not moved closer, yet his presence seemed to influence the awareness of those who noticed him. His attention remained on Ava, not Emily. There was no emotional reaction on his face, only quiet evaluation. A hotel manager nearby stepped slightly closer to Ethan, as if anticipating direction, but Ethan did not speak. Instead, his focus remained fixed on Ava as she calmly reviewed the setup once more. At that moment, another minor issue arose near the back section of the ballroom. A catering coordinator signaled urgently that a timing conflict had emerged between the service schedule and the ceremony queue. Without hesitation, Ava moved toward the issue. She spoke briefly with the coordinator, reviewed the updated schedule on a tablet, and adjusted the sequence timing in coordination with the technical team. The correction was executed within moments. No disruption reached the guests. No announcement was made. Everything simply returned to alignment. Emily, however, interpreted Ava's continued involvement as defiance rather than competence. Her frustration grew, and she began to speak again, but her words were interrupted by a subtle shift in the room's attention. Several guests were no longer watching Emily. They were watching Ava, not because she demanded it, but because every problem in the room seemed to resolve itself when she intervened. Ethan finally took a slow step forward, still silent, still observing. His eyes moved briefly from Ava to Emily, then back again. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. One person attempted to control the environment through authority. The other maintained control by understanding it completely, and without anyone announcing it aloud. The perception inside the ballroom continued to change in a way that Emily Hastings was only just beginning to sense, but not yet fully understand. The tension inside the Grand Meridian Ballroom had reached a point where even the smallest movement felt amplified. Conversations had nearly faded completely, replaced by a focused silence that followed every interaction near the ceremony space. The chandeliers above continued to glow with elegant warmth, but the emotional temperature of the room had shifted significantly. Emily Hastings stood near the front rows of seating, her posture rigid, her frustration now less controlled than before. She looked toward Ava Johnson, who remained composed as she coordinated final adjustments with the technical team. The contrast between them had become impossible to ignore for many of the guests watching quietly from their seats. Ethan Kong had moved closer to the central aisle, still maintaining distance from direct interaction, yet positioned where he could observe everything without obstruction. His expression remained calm, unreadable, and focused entirely on patterns rather than emotions. He was no longer watching individual actions in isolation. He was observing the structure forming around those actions. A hotel executive standing near him spoke softly, almost instinctively lowering his voice. "She has handled every issue tonight without escalation," he said, referring to Ava. Ethan did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Ava as she calmly resolved another coordination issue between the ceremony timing and the reception flow. After a brief pause, he finally spoke in a low tone. "That is not reaction," he said. "That is control." Across the ballroom, Emily noticed Ethan's presence more clearly for the first time. Something about the way he observed the room made her uneasy, though she could not immediately explain why. She adjusted her posture slightly, attempting to regain composure, but the environment no longer responded to her in the way she expected. Attention was not gathering around her anymore. It was shifting elsewhere. A minor disruption occurred near the floral installation at the edge of the ceremony aisle. A section of arrangement had been incorrectly positioned, causing concern among the decor team. Before any discussion could escalate, Ava had already arrived at the location. She reviewed the placement, exchanged a brief set of instructions with the florist, and corrected the alignment within moments. The issue disappeared without drawing attention. Several guests who had been watching quietly began to notice a pattern forming. Every time a problem appeared, Ava resolved it without hesitation, without visible stress, and without needing validation from anyone in the room. Emily, however, interpreted the situation differently. To her, Ava's constant presence in operational decisions felt like overreach rather than competence. Her frustration resurfaced, but this time it carried uncertainty beneath it. For the first time since the event began, she was no longer fully confident that her perception of control matched reality. Ethan's attention shifted briefly toward Emily, then returned to Ava. The difference between authority and execution was becoming increasingly clear to him. One relied on expectation. The other relied on capability. And as the evening continued, the ballroom itself seemed to be aligning more with capability than expectation. Without announcement, without confrontation, and without dramatic interruption, the balance inside the room continued to shift in a direction that Emily Hastings was only just beginning to feel, but had not yet fully understood. The Grand Meridian Ballroom had reached a state of controlled anticipation. The ceremony had not yet begun, but the emotional weight inside the room had grown significantly. Guests sat in quiet formation beneath the crystal chandeliers, their attention no longer focused on decoration or timing, but on the subtle tension that had been building between perception and reality throughout the evening. Emily Hastings stood near the front row, her posture still rigid, but her confidence now visibly fractured at the edges. She had begun to notice something she could not easily dismiss. The room was no longer responding to her in the way she expected. Instead of agreement or compliance, she felt observation, not directed at her authority, but at her behavior. Across the ballroom, Ava Johnson continued her work with the same calm precision that had defined her entire presence throughout the event. She moved through each remaining adjustment with quiet efficiency, speaking briefly with staff, confirming final timing details, and ensuring that every element remained aligned with the ceremony plan. There was no urgency in her actions, no visible stress, only consistency. And that consistency had become impossible for many of the guests to ignore. Ethan Kong remained positioned near the central aisle, partially within the shadow of the architectural lighting. He had not intervened since his earlier statements, nor had he needed to. His presence alone seemed to shift how others interpreted the unfolding situation. He watched Ava closely, not as someone performing a task, but as someone revealing character under sustained pressure. A nearby hotel executive, standing just behind him, spoke quietly. "She has not made a single emotional reaction all evening," he said, referring to Ava. Ethan responded after a brief pause. "That is because she does not operate from emotion," he said. "She operates from structure." The executive nodded slowly, as if processing the distinction. Meanwhile, Emily attempted to regain control over the situation by addressing a minor concern with the seating arrangement near the ceremony entrance. Her tone was firm, but the response she received from staff was measured rather than immediate compliance. A coordinator looked briefly toward Ava before confirming the adjustment. That moment did not go unnoticed by Emily. It was subtle, but it reinforced something she had been resisting internally. Influence in a room was no longer responding to position alone. It was responding to capability. A few moments later, a final pre-ceremony verification issue arose regarding the synchronization of the entrance music with lighting transitions. The technical team hesitated briefly, uncertain about the exact adjustment required. Before uncertainty could spread, Ava stepped in. She reviewed the sequence calmly, made a precise correction to the timing alignment, and confirmed the adjustment with the lead technician. The system stabilized immediately. There was no interruption to the guest experience. No announcement was needed. Everything continued seamlessly. Several guests who had been watching quietly exchanged brief glances, now fully recognizing the pattern that had repeated throughout the evening. Whenever instability appeared, Ava resolved it without escalation, without visibility, and without disruption. Ethan observed this without expression, but with clear understanding. Control is not what you demand, he said quietly, almost to himself. It is what remains when nothing else is stable. Emily overheard only fragments of the statement, but it was enough to unsettle her further. For the first time, she became aware that her authority was being measured not by intention, but by outcome. And in that comparison, she was no longer certain she held the stronger position. The ballroom remained quiet, the ceremony still unstarted, but the underlying structure of perception within the room had already shifted beyond the point of return. The atmosphere inside the Grand Meridian Ballroom had grown still in a way that felt almost intentional. The chandeliers above continued to glow with steady elegance, casting soft light across the rows of guests seated in perfect alignment. Yet beneath that visual perfection, the emotional state of the room had shifted into something far more concentrated. Attention was no longer scattered across conversations or decorations. It was centered on perception, on behavior, and on the subtle hierarchy forming in real time between those who acted and those who observed. Ava Johnson remained near the ceremony staging area, continuing her work with the same controlled precision that had defined her presence throughout the evening. She checked the final alignment of the aisle markers, confirmed the cue sequence with the audio technician, and made one last adjustment to the floral symmetry along the front row. Each movement was deliberate, efficient, and unaccompanied by emotional display. For Ava, nothing had changed. The work still needed to be completed correctly, regardless of the atmosphere surrounding it. Emily Hastings stood slightly behind the front seating area, her posture now less rigid than before. The confidence she had carried earlier in the evening had not fully disappeared, but it had been replaced by something more uncertain. She was no longer reacting to individual moments. She was reacting to a pattern she could no longer ignore. Staff members did not look to her for final confirmation in the way she expected. Instead, they often glanced toward Ava before proceeding. That subtle shift repeated itself enough times that it became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Across the ballroom, Ethan Kong remained in a fixed position near the central aisle. He had not intervened further since his earlier statements, yet his presence continued to influence the room in a quiet, unavoidable way. People adjusted their tone when passing near him. Conversations shortened when he was within hearing distance. He did not demand attention, but attention adjusted itself around him. A hotel executive approached him briefly, speaking in a low voice. "The ceremony timing is fully stabilized now," he said. Ethan nodded once, then responded without turning his gaze away from Ava. "It was never about timing," he said calmly. "It was about how quickly instability is resolved." The executive did not reply, only acknowledged the statement with a slight nod before stepping back. At that moment, a final issue arose near the guest seating coordination. A discrepancy in the reserved seating chart threatened to create confusion as guests prepared for final entry. The coordination team hesitated, unsure whether to escalate the issue or wait for confirmation from the bride's side. Before hesitation could develop further, Ava arrived. She reviewed the seating chart quietly, identified the discrepancy within seconds, and adjusted the assignments with precise instruction to the coordinator team. There was no pause in communication, no emotional escalation, and no visible disruption to the room. The correction was implemented immediately and seamlessly. Guests nearby remained largely unaware that any issue had existed at all. Emily, however, noticed something different this time. It was not the correction itself, but the absence of her involvement in the correction process. The system was no longer routing through her perception of control. It was routing through execution. That realization created a quiet discomfort that she could not easily articulate. Ethan observed this entire sequence without change in expression. Then, after a brief silence, he spoke softly to himself, though the words were audible enough for those nearby to hear. "Authority is not defined by position," he said. "It is defined by whether or not the system functions without you." The statement settled into the room without reaction, but it remained present in the awareness of those who heard it. Emily slowly turned her attention toward Ava again, this time not with frustration, but with something less certain. For the first time since the evening began, she was no longer confident that she understood the structure of a room she was standing in. And as the final preparations for the ceremony reached completion, that uncertainty became the quiet foundation of everything that was about to follow. The ballroom had reached a state of complete stillness that felt heavier than any music or announcement. The chandeliers continued to shine above the guests, casting elegant reflections across the marble floor. But the atmosphere had shifted into something more concentrated, as if the entire room was now aware that the evening had moved beyond ceremony preparation and into something far more decisive. Ava Johnson stood near the front staging area, reviewing the final sequence one last time with the technical team. Her voice remained calm, her instructions precise, and her movements unhurried. Nothing in her behavior suggested urgency or pressure, even though the entire event depended on flawless execution in the moments ahead. Emily Hastings remained near the front seating section, no longer speaking with the same authority she had earlier in the evening. Her attention had turned inward, shaped by the accumulation of subtle moments she could no longer dismiss. Each instance where staff deferred to Ava instead of her, each correction made without her input, each calm resolution of a problem she had not even been consulted about, now formed a pattern she was reluctantly beginning to recognize. Across the ballroom, Ethan Kong remained his position near the central aisle, his presence steady and unchanged. He did not interact, yet his awareness shaped the way others moved around him. Conversations remained minimal in his vicinity, and even small gestures from staff carried added caution. He was not the center of attention, yet nothing important seemed to occur without being measured against his silent observation. A final coordination issue emerged near the entrance timing sequence as the ceremony was moments away from beginning. A slight misalignment between the guest entry cue and lighting transition threatened to disrupt the flow. The technical team hesitated for only a moment before Ava arrived. She reviewed the sequence without speaking, identified the misalignment immediately, and adjusted the timing protocol with calm efficiency. The correction was completed within seconds. No disruption followed. No guest noticed the adjustment taking place. The system simply returned to balance. Emily watched this from a distance. This time, her reaction was different. It was no longer frustration. It was realization forming slowly beneath her composure. She had expected authority to be visible, vocal, and absolute. What she was witnessing instead was authority that required none of those things. Ethan observed Ava during the correction, his expression unchanged but his attention fully engaged. After a brief pause, he spoke quietly, not to anyone in particular, but in a tone that carried clarity. True structure does not need recognition, he said. It only needs consistency. The words settled into the room without interruption. Guests near him did not respond, but several seemed to absorb the weight of the statement without fully acknowledging it. Emily, however, felt it differently. For the first time, she was no longer measuring Ava against her own expectations of authority. She was measuring herself against Ava's results. The difference was no longer subtle. It was visible in every interaction she had witnessed throughout the evening. As the final preparations concluded and the ballroom transitioned into complete readiness for the ceremony, Ava completed her final check and stepped back from the staging area. Her role, in this moment, was no longer active correction. It was confirmation. Everything was aligned. Everything was stable. And everything, without exception, had been maintained without disruption or escalation. Ethan finally shifted his position slightly, turning his attention from Ava toward the center of the room where the ceremony would begin. The silence that followed was not empty. It was structured, and within that structure, every person present understood, even without words, that the true foundation of the evening had already been revealed long before the first vow would ever be spoken. The Grand Meridian Ballroom stood in a state of complete anticipation, as if the entire space was holding its breath before a final irreversible moment. The chandeliers above continued to glow with soft golden intensity, reflecting across the marble floor and white floral arrangements that lined the ceremony aisle. Every seat was now filled. Every guest was silent. Even the subtle sounds of movement from the staff had nearly disappeared, replaced by a stillness that felt intentional rather than accidental. Ava Johnson remained near the side of the ceremony staging area, her presence calm and unchanged despite the weight of everything that had unfolded throughout the evening. She had already completed every required adjustment, verified every sequence, and confirmed every operational detail with precision. Now, she simply observed, ensuring that nothing would disrupt the transition into the ceremony itself. Emily Hastings stood among her bridal party, her posture no longer rigid with confidence, but restrained with uncertainty. The earlier expectation that everything would revolve around her direction had slowly dissolved over the course of the evening. What remained was a quiet awareness that the room no longer responded to her in the way she assumed it should. It responded to outcomes, not authority. Across the ballroom, Ethan Kong stood near the central aisle once more. His presence remained subtle but undeniable. He had not intervened again since the final sequence adjustments, yet his attention remained fully engaged with the environment around him. He was no longer observing isolated actions. He was observing alignment. The alignment of people, decisions, and consequences within a single controlled space. A final pre-ceremony confirmation was requested by the event coordinator. A brief moment of hesitation passed through the technical team as they verified the synchronization between lighting, music, and entry timing. Before any uncertainty could develop, Ava moved forward. She reviewed the entire sequence once more, confirmed the stability of each element, and gave a single, quiet acknowledgement. The system was ready. There was no announcement, no interruption, only confirmation. Guests felt the transition instinctively. The atmosphere shifted from preparation to expectation. Ethan's gaze moved briefly across the room before settling once again on Ava. After a long pause, he spoke softly, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "Everything that matters has already revealed itself," he said. The words were not directed at any single person, yet they settled heavily into the silence of the room. Emily heard them clearly. She did not respond, but her expression reflected a realization she could no longer delay. The evening had not been shaped by appearance, status, or expectation. It had been shaped by consistency under pressure. Ava remained still, her role now fully complete in terms of preparation. She did not seek acknowledgement. She did not require recognition. She simply ensured readiness. Ethan finally turned his attention toward the front of the ballroom where the ceremony was meant to begin. The guests remained silent, waiting for a moment that now felt less like celebration and more like revelation. And within that silence, the structure of the entire evening reached its final point of clarity, where every action, every observation, and every decision converged into an understanding that no one in the room could unsee. The Grand Meridian Ballroom had reached its final state of silence. Every guest was seated. Every light had been adjusted. Every technical element had been verified. The air inside the room felt dense with expectation, as if the entire space understood that nothing further needed to be corrected. The ceremony was no longer being prepared. It was ready to begin. Ava Johnson stood near the side of the aisle, her final responsibilities complete. She no longer needed to intervene in any systems or adjust any details. Her role had transitioned from execution to observation. Everything functioned because she had ensured it would. She remained calm, composed, and entirely still, not seeking recognition for the work she had already finished. Emily Hastings stood among her bridal party, her expression no longer carrying the sharp confidence she had shown earlier in the evening. Instead, there was a quiet stillness in her posture, one that suggested awareness rather than control. The environment around her had shifted in a way she could no longer influence. She was no longer the center of reaction. She was part of the observation. Across the ballroom, Ethan Kong stood at the edge of the central aisle, his attention fixed forward. He had not moved for several moments. His presence remained subtle, yet it shaped the awareness of those around him. Guests who were near him instinctively lowered their voices. Staff members maintained careful distance. He did not command attention. He simply altered how attention behaved. The ceremony coordinator signaled for final readiness. A brief pause followed as the entire room absorbed the final confirmation. Then, without announcement, Ethan began to walk slowly toward the center of the aisle. His movement was unhurried, deliberate, and uninterrupted. Conversations did not resume. No one spoke. The chandeliers above cast steady light across his path, reflecting softly off the marble floor. He stopped at a point where he could see both Ava and Emily clearly. For a moment, he said nothing. The silence deepened further. Then he spoke in a calm, even voice that carried through the ballroom without effort. "Everything that has occurred here tonight has already revealed its own conclusion," he said. The words were not dramatic, but they were absolute. Several guests instinctively lowered their gaze. Emily remained still, listening without interruption. Ethan continued, "A ceremony is not defined by intention. It is defined by structure. And structure does not respond to expectation. It responds to integrity." A faint shift moved through the room. It was not visible, but it was felt. Ava remained motionless, her attention on Ethan, not in anticipation, but in understanding. Emily's expression softened slightly, as though something she had been resisting internally was no longer sustainable. Ethan turned his gaze briefly toward Ava. There was no judgment in his expression, only recognition. Then he looked toward Emily. The contrast between perception and reality had already been established throughout the evening. Now it required no further explanation. After a brief silence, Ethan gave a slight nod. It was subtle but final. The signal did not require words. The ballroom responded instinctively. Guests adjusted in their seats. Staff prepared for transition. The ceremony would not proceed as originally expected. Instead, what remained was acknowledgement of what had already been understood by everyone who had been paying attention. Ava had not needed validation. Emily had not recognized reality until it could no longer be ignored. And Ethan had not influenced the outcome. He had only confirmed what had already been revealed through every action that came before this moment. As the chandeliers continued to glow above the silent room, the final truth of the evening settled without announcement, without conflict, and without resistance. Respect had not been decided in that moment. It had already been determined long before anyone realized it.